end of his consumer, you have to deliver for them. This channel. I remember my mother also died of cancer, lung cancer, and entertainment, Capri.
You know, I had a choice in that process where I made myself
registered deep thoughts, but she has a loving heart.
in the heresy.
Brian Selznick, welcome to the Bookaholic Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Yes, I am so glad you're here. I got this book in the mail, Big Tree, your latest, and I thought, oh my goodness, it's gigantic. It's a tome. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just give it a try. And I saw that it did have illustrations. I said, so maybe I can get through it pretty quickly. And so I took it and I started reading it and I fell in love. I
Oh,
fell in love and I have finished it. I just got it the other day. I read it and I finished it. And it's one of those books that I do like this. I'm holding it close and to my heart because it is absolutely beautiful.
oh
It's
my
just
gosh.
beautiful.
Thank you.
And it's just in time for Earth Day later on here in the month. And I just do believe this is a beautiful volume to introduce children to, or if I had any grandchildren to. It's just beautiful. And it's a classic book that every family should have on their bookshelf, first of all.
Mm.
I can remember being a little girl and older people taking me around in their arms and showing me different trees and the leaves of the trees, like this is a maple leaf and this is a da-da-da, and this is a pine tree, etc. And I think people still show their children stuff, but maybe not leaves shapes because they don't know them. They don't know them. And I think this book, it has many layers. I want to talk about those layers, and I think it can point us back to reconnecting with nature. Now, before we dive further into my just opinion of this wonderful book, I do want to introduce my audience to you. And they are familiar with some of your work, probably particularly in the movie version of Hugo, which is from your book titled Hugo, the Invention of Hugo Cabret.
Yeah.
Did I say all of that right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I remember taking my sons. I remember my husband and I taking our sons to see Hugo.
Oh, that's so
And
fantastic.
yes. And they're grown men now. So I guess that was many, many years ago now.
Time has
So,
passed.
yes, time has passed. But that was a movie that we enjoyed it, and taking our children to. And that was famously directed by Martin Scorsese, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's a little woo, wow, that's fantastic. And
Yeah.
this book, Big Tree, it's really the concept of Steven Spielberg, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Steven Spielberg and maybe a production partner wanted to do a movie. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah. Steven Spielberg, and he was partnering with a producer named Chris Meledandri from Illumination Studios. And Steven Spielberg had an idea, and he wanted me to write this movie based on his idea. And he flew me across the country, and I was like so nervous and so excited and couldn't believe it was happening. And the idea that he had was to tell a story about nature from nature's point of view, because he was worried about the planet, like so many of us are. And he
Yes.
realized he had never seen a movie that was told from nature's point of view, from the plant's point of view.
Right.
And I thought to myself, well, maybe the reason we've never seen that is because you can't actually make a movie from the point of view of plants. Maybe it's a little too
Right.
difficult.
Right.
Plants don't have faces, and so it's a
Right.
little challenging.
Yeah. Yes.
But it was such an honor that he thought about me. And
Yes.
the first conversation went so well, he invited me to come back the next month. And I ended up getting the chance to be with him 4 times. And I
Oh,
began
wow.
I began to develop this story for a screenplay. I wasn't doing any art. It was going to be all designed by professional animators, so I was just writing. But
Right.
I came up with this idea to tell a story about two little sycamore seeds, who I named Merwin and Louise, who would be set off into the world after being separated from their mama tree, as seeds are. And
Yes.
they would both be trying to find a safe place to grow, while
Yes.
also beginning to realize that they might be responsible for having to save the entire planet in some
Yes.
fashion.
Yes.
And I decided to set it at the end of the Cretaceous era, because that was the moment when the asteroid was coming to hit the planet that destroyed most
Yes.
life on Earth. And
Yes.
it felt like a really good metaphor for the
Right.
existential crisis that we're facing right now with the environment.
Right.
And the
Exactly.
fact that we all, many of us, feel very tiny and insignificant and unable to do anything, and pretty hopeless in a lot of ways. We might feel
Right.
hopeless. But I started wondering if I could tell a story about two, like, literally tiny creatures, little beings,
Yes.
who
Yes.
somehow find a way to connect with the bigger world, with the bigger community, and actually do something. Because that's like, I tend to write stories that first are about helping me get through the day. Like, what is it
Yeah.
that I need to learn, right? And,
Right.
like, we all have a lot of things we need to learn. But
Yes.
for me, especially when I began writing this, and sort of the turn that it took when the pandemic hit, was
Uh, uh,
was that I really needed to remain hopeful, right? Because there's
right.
so many things and so much trauma and grief and just horror, that
Right.
it is really easy to be without hope, or to think that you're without hope. And
Most
so,
definitely.
yeah, so for me, a lot of Big Tree was trying to remind myself that I need to remain hopeful. And so,
Yes.
so Spielberg and Meledandri were amazing mentors and great sounding boards, and they gave me incredible feedback. And and really, when the pandemic hit, it became very clear very quickly that the movie was never going to happen, for
Right.
obvious reasons, because the
Right.
pandemic changed everything, and a lot of things
Yes.
that were going stopped.
Yes. Yeah.
And but I had fallen in love with the characters. I had fallen in love with the story, and then in the pandemic, this story about trying to be hopeful in the face of catastrophe suddenly felt like even more important.
Yes.
And so I asked Spielberg and Meledandri if I could turn the story into a book,
Yeah.
and they were very enthusiastic and said yes. And so suddenly I got to illustrate the book. I realized I don't need to put faces on the seeds, because I'm trying to base everything in science, and plants just don't have faces, but they do
Right.
have the ability to communicate. So talking
Yes.
is okay, because plants do
Yes.
communicate. So it was, for
Yeah.
me, it was all about finding the right way to anthropomorphize these little seeds, so that I was being honest to the science, while
Right.
also bringing them a real sense. This is going to sound ironic, but a real sense of humanity, right? Because
Right.
of course they are actually us, right?
Right.
They are little sycamore seeds, literally, but then
Yes.
they are us. And so,
Yes.
the fact that this book exists itself feels like a miracle. And
Yes.
in a funny way, even though it started as a movie, I really think that this story was always meant to be a book. And so the
Mm.
fact that I got the chance to figure that out, uh,
Yes.
one of the silver linings of the pandemic. Like, I always like asking people what their silver lining is, because not everyone,
Mm.
of course, not everyone thinks that they might have one. But I think for
Right.
a lot of people, there are weird, unexpectedly positive things that came out of the pandemic. And I think it's good to
Correct.
remember that that's okay. And
Yes, correct.
yeah,
You
and
know, we talk about the pandemic a lot on this channel, because a lot of people wrote books during that era, and yes, there have been unexpected blessings, believe it or not, that came through that pandemic.
yeah,
And
yeah.
one of the things that we have talked about was the self-care aspect and making
Mm,
people more aware of phrases such as microaggressions,
Mhm.
narcissism, empaths, and those type of things. So yeah, I agree with you totally. And I'm so glad, that you sat down and asked yourself these questions each and every day, because you truly did some soul searching and has brought a lot of beauty to us by this book.
Oh,
You
thanks.
know, one of the things I get from this and that pulled at my heartstrings first were the fact that these seeds were with their mom tree and they were a family,
Yeah.
you know, and Merwin had his heart set on taking care of his sister Louise. I mean, and so I got a lot out of this, not from the just the scientific and the nature and aspect, but there was a family aspect here
Mm.
too.
Yeah.
And Merwin grew up, so to speak, and learned his lesson. And Louise, she kind of stopped being. She was never naive. You thought she was naive. She was never naive. She was always listening to that inner self. And then, oh, it's just so beautiful. I don't want to spoil the ending. I don't want to spoil the ending,
Thank you.
but it's a beautiful family story.
Thank you.
And I thought you were so smart when, and you go in the back of the book and it explains some of the scientific things, but when they were in a terrible mess in the water, in a shell, and the scientist appeared, and I was like, oh my goodness, he's really explaining what we later know as, you know, the fossils and all of those things, and the different rocks that come up, and the scientists now can look at them and tell what era they even came from. And they were like, well, we're the little scientists now doing all of this stuff
Mhm.
to this shell to make it to be. Oh, and I was just like, oh my goodness, this is just wonderful. And what was the other thing? I think the other thing, the butterfly was beautiful, but the ferns, and you
Mm.
know, when you're in school and you're learning about all these ancient eras, it's
Mm.
the fern that has always been there. The
Yep.
fern was always around, you know,
Yep.
moss and ferns and all of these things. So it just was quite powerful from that whole aspect. It was a community. It was a
Mhm.
whole community. And every time the mom tree, they talked about her bringing up the water to, oh, just beautiful. I just love it.
Oh,
And it's right up there. I've read in your bio where some people had compared, you know, you a little bit to Frank L. Baum and the Wizard of Oz.
yeah.
But a lot of people don't know that there's a Frank L. Baum story about the origins of Santa Claus.
Really?
And I have read that as well. And I don't know how I lucked up on it. It was just a Christmas book. I'm crazy about Christmas. And so I
Yeah.
ordered it. And like I said, my children are grown, but I still love Christmas. We all love Christmas as a family. And I bought this book last year and read that origin of Santa Claus from Frank L. Baum. And it is not just like, but it's on the same scale
Oh,
as Big Tree.
oh,
You
wow.
know, he's Santa Claus comes from all these nature creatures, mythical nature
Oh,
creatures,
wonderful.
fairies, and all of these things. And he grows up, and then there's this big woodsman, like the old one,
Yeah.
you know, and so just beautiful. And I
Oh,
thought about that story when I read this book. It's just extraordinary. And
oh,
I again, I will repeat, this is a book that needs to be on every family's bookshelf, just like you have what's the other Christmas book? It was about Saint Nick, the one
oh,
you read every Christmas about Saint Nick. I mean, it's just that much of a classic book that you need to have on your
oh,
shelf. I mean, I can just see the quality time one can spend with their child or grandchild and going through this book.
oh,
And now let's talk about your illustrations, which are amazing.
oh, thank
And
you.
you show your little seeds, and it talks from time to time about their fluff kind of wearing off or disappearing. And I was like, oh, please let the
Keep
fluff go
going, keep
all the way
going.
off. Please hold on. You know, and so that was just precious. And you can tell what even in its graphic look, you can tell, you know, Merwin and
Oh,
Louise and
good.
the giants and all of these things. It's very clear. And the illustrations mean just as much as the words.
Oh,
How
cool.
did you come to strike that balance
Mm.
between, the words and the artwork?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think visually. So I'm usually seeing something before I'm even writing it. But when I'm making a
Mm,
book, I'm very interested in what happens when you turn the page and how you tell a story. And when I was making The Invention of Hugo Cabret, which is actually related to the history of cinema, one of the
mm,
characters in it is a silent movie director. I
wow.
realized that there's an interesting connection between picture books, like Where the Wild Things Are, and
Yeah,
movies, because the
yeah,
way you move through like the wild rumpus and Where the Wild Things Are, and how a movie might go through a tracking shot where the camera is moving for a long time without any editing, or when you edit from one scene to the
right,
next scene, I realized that I can take some of these cinematic techniques and
right.
use them when you're turning the pages in a book. And you can
Yeah,
have big sequences where there's no words, and instead of describing like Hugo runs down the hallway, you could
right.
have 10 pages where you see him running down hallways. And for
Yes, yes,
Tree, I knew that I wanted to help the viewer feel, or the reader feel, like they were inside this story. And
yeah,
by drawing the forests and the trees and going underwater and being in the waves and the shells and everything is
yeah,
happening to these two little seeds, because we're seeing it for like
yes,
a third or a half of the book, we could
yeah,
feel like we're immersed in this world a little bit more. And that
yes,
was very interesting to me, or that is very interesting to me whenever I'm making a story and trying to figure out how I can tell the story. And when I'm doing drawings, I generally don't like to do what people often do in comic books and graphic novels, which is to have like a speech bubble, which is great.
right, right.
When I'm drawing in my books, I very often like to just have the whole page, the whole spread be
Yes,
a picture. And so
yes,
if there's going to be any thoughts or any words in dialogue, it has to be on a separate page where you can
right,
read about what the characters are thinking and what they're saying to each other, and sometimes what they're doing. But then
right,
if it's just action where you're watching the seeds like move through the water or go through the forest, or a dinosaur is coming and it's going to eat them, you can turn
right,
the page, like you might read, what's that sound? I don't know what it is. Oh my
right.
gosh, look. And then you turn the page and it's the giant foot of a dinosaur. And then for the
Yes,
next 10 pages, the dinosaur is just slowly moving past the view screen of the book. And so
yes,
that's really fun to play with
yes.
when I'm making the pictures in a book.
Well, it definitely, for me, the pictures even spoke.
Oh, good.
They were just so, I'm looking at a big eye right now of one of the pages. I mean, once you turn the page, the pictures spoke to me as well, and it brought, of course, more vividness to the story.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things I'm always interested in when talking to authors, rather, is how a lot of times how you come up with the world that you create, but your world's based on science. But how did you come up with the name Merwin? I was like, I've never even heard that as a name. And Louise, I thought she was applicably, aproposly named Louise.
Okay.
But what about Merwin? Where did that come from?
Yeah, I was beginning to think about what these characters were going to be like, and like who, if there was anyone I wanted to reference. And at the beginning of the pandemic, someone sent me a quote from a poem. I'm sure a lot of your viewers had moments where inspiring quotes were
Yeah,
sent, or they found something that moved them and they knew that this could help someone feel better. And
yeah,
so we sometimes in difficult times we share inspiring quotes.
right.
And someone sent me a line from a poem by a poet named W.S. Merwin, William S. Merwin. And the
Oh,
line from the poem was, "On the last day of the world, I would want to plant a tree."
oh wow.
And
Oh
that,
my goodness.
right? So that idea that
Yeah,
even in the face of catastrophe, the end of everything, the
yes.
poet is saying he would still want to do something hopeful, because planting a
Yes,
tree is about the future, right? Trees
yes,
sometimes take 500 years to reach maturity. So,
exactly,
so this
exactly.
idea that even in the face of the end of the world, of complete catastrophe, he
Yeah.
still wanted to be hopeful. Made
Yes,
me feel like,
yes,
oh, I forgot about hope. Like,
Wow.
I need to be hopeful.
Yes.
Pandemic shut
Yes.
everything down. I was separated from my husband by he was across the country. I didn't know when
Right.
I was going to see him again. Like, we
Right.
were all so devastated. And
Yes.
suddenly I was like, oh, right. I should try to think about maybe being hopeful. So I had W.S. Merwin in my mind. And the
Uh,
funny thing is, I gave his name to the very, very uptight character. And the character who's actually very poetic and dreamy is Louise. And I
yes.
named her after a scientist named Dr. Louise Colville, who studies seeds.
Oh my
So
gosh.
so the poet
Oh.
is actually named after the scientist, and the scientific character is actually named after the poet.
Oh, wow. Oh my gosh. That is just wonderful. I mean, and I love that they have meaning and not just pulled out of the air.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
they
I
definitely have
love that.
meaning.
Now, one of the other things that intrigued me, and to my audience, I will say you have a little section at the back talking about the science, which is wonderful for people to shore up the story of Big Tree. And I noticed that, and I was wondering why the sycamore tree. And then I thought, and I live in North Carolina, so I'm surrounded by trees.
Mhm.
And I was like, sycamore tree, why the sycamore tree? Why was that so important? And you say here, the sycamore tree family really was around during the Cretaceous period,
Yep.
see fossil species. And I didn't know that. So all of the other trees weren't around during that time. So the
So
sycamore must be a powerful, powerful tree.
yeah. So the one of the first things I did when I began researching the story was reach out to someone who is a paleobotanist who studies
Mhm.
ancient plants.
Oh
And
yes.
he works at this guy, Jamie Boyer, works at the New York Botanical Gardens. And
Okay.
he's the one who introduced me to this idea of fossil species, which are plants that have been alive since the time of the dinosaurs and earlier. So
Oh,
you mentioned earlier that ferns have been around forever. So they
mhm.
are known as a fossil species. It turns out
Okay.
sycamores have been around since at least the Cretaceous era.
Okay.
Ginkgo trees, I'm sure a lot of people live near ginkgo trees.
Yeah.
They have been around since then. So the idea that I could make the main character a tree that was actually around at the time of the dinosaurs, but could still be a tree that you
Right.
could go outside and
Yes.
see was
Yeah.
very important to me. And,
Wow.
and on top of that, the sycamore actually develops its seeds in these seed balls, which is a little bit like a nursery, right?
Yes.
It
Yes.
really is like all these siblings are in a little nursery together, and
Oh,
they then have to disperse and go out into the world. So there were
yes.
all of these interesting elements about sycamore trees that felt like they would work well for my story. And you had mentioned the importance of the family aspect for you in
Yeah.
this story, and I just wanted
Yes.
to say that makes me, I'm really happy to hear that, because that was very, very central. Yes, the science is important, but
Yes.
the real thing that I was trying to get at was these ideas around family. And
Yes.
one of the things that I put into the book that was important to me was something that a friend of mine, Deborah Hallen Zelinsky, always used to
Mhm.
say to me about raising kids. I don't have kids, but she has two great daughters,
Yes.
and she says to me that the job of every parent is to give their children roots and wings. Roots so that they feel safe and they know what their family's history is, and they know where they come from. But
Yes.
a good parent also gives their children wings so that
That's
they
good.
can fly off and go out into the world and make their own way, but
Yes.
always know that they have these important roots. And
Yes.
she has said that to me for years and years. So when I began to work on Big Tree, I remembered that she said that to me, and I
Yes.
thought, who better to say that in a story than an actual tree? Like, what if
Yes.
Mama Tree actually tells her children, a good parent gives their children roots and wings,
Oh
and
my God.
that helps the children, because it's scary to go off into the world on your own, right?
It
And I'm
is.
sure, again, I'm not a parent, but I bet it's scary for a parent to let their kids go, right?
Yes, it
Want
is.
you want to protect your kids, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
we all
Yes.
know that, like, we have to go out into the world, and it's a dangerous world out there
It
for
is.
many
It is.
reasons. And
Yes.
but if a kid knows that they are loved and that they come from somewhere strong and they feel that security, we hope that we can have that security as we head out into the world. I was a kid who was raised by very supportive parents who then let me go out, and for me, part of what was scary was moving to New York, right? Because
Yes.
I was raised in New Jersey in the 70s when the idea of
Yes.
New York was terrifying. And the
Yeah.
first thing I wanted to do after college was move to New York, and my parents were like, "Oh my gosh, that's so scary." But
Yeah.
they ultimately supported me, and I was safe. I was okay.
Yes.
But
Yes.
that idea for family and knowing where you come from and knowing
Yes.
that you have somewhere to go was
Yes.
something I really wanted to put into Big Tree.
Well, definitely it is in there. It is
Okay.
100% in there, and I loved that, and I did not know that a friend of yours had told you about the roots and the wings, and that was another thing that pulled at my heartstrings. Like I said, this is a book of many layers. It's very important about the nature aspect, and that's the first reason that it came across and that you wrote it for, but that family aspect is also in there, and it really means still a lot to children who have lost a parent, that they can go on even though their parent may be gone, their mother may be gone, or these children that are in foster situations or adoptive situations. It's still inspirational for all forms and formats of family.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
roots aren't just biological, right?
That's
Roots
right.
are the people around you who love you and support you. And my
Yes.
books, again and again, from Hugo to Wonderstruck to the Marvels and especially Big Tree, are very much about family and finding family and making family outside of your biological family. And that's not to discount the biological family in any way, but
No.
it's a way to say it's as powerful and as important to create a family and
Yes.
a community, because that, again, like in the end, a lot of Big Tree is about recognizing that we're all part of a community. Our family is a community. Our family is part of a larger community of other families. That community is part of a bigger community of who we are and where we come from, and that those circles keep getting bigger and bigger until, if you really step back, it's everybody, right? We're all
Yes.
part of the same community.
Yes, yes, yes. Just amazing. Now, Big Tree is out for purchase. It was published the
Yesterday.
other day. Yesterday. Okay.
It's
And
brand new.
and
It's a new baby.
yes, so it's just published yesterday, so you can easily go ahead and purchase this book. You can also purchase the audiobook version in which Meryl Streep is the narrator.
Yeah, she's
That's
amazing. Not
I
surprising.
know.
She is extraordinary. I sent her the book and a note, and I just said, "Would you consider reading this?" And she loved the book, which itself was such an extraordinary thing to hear. And
I
then
know.
I got to sit with her in the recording booth for an entire day as she read the whole book. I made a special script because I had to replace the pictures with words that she could
Yes.
read.
Right.
But then there's music and there's sound effects, and she does 25 different voices for all of the characters in the book.
Oh
It,
my goodness.
it's unbelievable. So I
Oh
really
my
hope
word.
everybody gets a chance to hear it.
Well, I think I might circle back and do a reread through audiobook
Oh, I'd love
and
that.
listen to that as well. I think that would be amazing. And
Yeah.
Brian, might I say you must be living right to access Meryl Streep and Steven Spielberg. You you have to tell me your secret because obviously you are.
No, I've been very lucky, and in a lot of ways it goes back to Hugo, because I spent 3 years making this book about French silent movies that I didn't think anybody was going to read, and then
Right.
I sent it out into the world. Martin Scorsese got a copy,
That's right. That's
decided
another one.
right, so he got a copy, and someone sent it to him, I think, because they knew he had a 10-year-old daughter at the time, and
Okay. Okay.
he wanted to make a movie finally that his daughter could see, because he doesn't really
Yes.
make
Oh, yeah.
children's movies.
Right. His daughter couldn't see any of the movies he's made.
Yeah. And so I think once that happened, and Scorsese made this very beautiful film inspired by my book, it opened a lot of really extraordinary doors. And I think,
Yeah,
Spielberg came to Hugo because he's friends with Scorsese, and
right,
and then Scorsese, then
right, right, right,
Spielberg came
right.
to me. So it is like you can see all of these connections and all of these doors. But for me, really, like the main important thing is kids getting the chance to read the story and families getting the
Yeah,
chance to share the story. And yeah, like what Scorsese offered was exponentially more people being exposed to this story. And that's
right,
wonderful. I love the movie, but one of the really love the movie. But one of the great things is the movie brings a lot of people to the book. And
right,
and then they
right.
get to discover that there is a book, and then maybe that leads them to another book or learn more
Yes,
about something in the book. And this
yes,
idea of families being able to read together, and parents and children sharing these stories
right,
is that, part of what's so exciting to me about these unexpected connections that have happened
right.
is that it means more kids will potentially get the chance to hear or read these stories, and that's the main point of all of this.
Wonderful, and like one of the things Big Tree has done for me is that I'm seeking sycamore trees.
Oh, good.
Sycamore trees. I'm not the nature girl. I'm usually like, oh, there's a bug. I don't want to get outside. All of this stuff. But I do care. I have a very beautiful yard. I do have a real manicured yard and everything, but I don't do I don't do any of that work. But it's making me want to seek out learning more about like the sycamore trees and how all of this works within nature and to save our earth. I'm very concerned about our climate. I'm very concerned about all the things and the ramifications of what's going on right now. And so it is leading me to further study on more ways on how I can help. And I in a lot of organizations that I'm trying to think how we can pull together a quick project and plant some trees
Great.
towards the end of the month.
Great. Let's do it.
So definitely inspired all around and certainly by Big Tree.
Oh, thank you.
Brian Selznick, thank you so much for joining the Bookaholic podcast today with this inspirational story. I really appreciate you sitting down to pen it.
It was really, really fantastic to speak with you and get to share this with your audience. So thank you really so much for having me.
Yes, yes. Glad to have you here. And we'll have all of Brian's information and links to Big Tree in the podcast show notes and in the video description box on the YouTube channel. Brian, thank you again.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye.